Financing is key for national development. But what options are available to us in Nigeria? We've tried several options, including borrowing from abroad, borrowing locally, ways and means, and what have you. What are the options? Nigeria finds herself in a very tight situation as it is with regards to our finances. We seem to have, taken as much money as we should, and people are protesting in one way or the other about our debt to revenue ratio and what have you. But there are other options as well to financing. Have we considered very strongly the role of public-private partnerships, PPP, in financing our national projects, especially on the capital side? How well are we doing in this regard? What has been the success beyond mounting off PPPs as a very nice way of financing projects and our capital transactions in Nigeria? Which states are doing well? Have we even taken this very seriously at the state level, apart from the federal level? Which projects can we point to? And of course, as we navigate a very difficult financial terrain in this country going forward, should PPPs not be playing a bigger role? What models should we adopt? There are different kind of models under PPP: build, own and transfer, build, run and transfer, and so on and so forth. Which one do we choose? Which ones are good? And these are very critical considerations. What has been the performance of this kind of projects and this kind of transactions, even in other countries around us? We want to be looking at PPPs at the national and subnational level today. And joining us to do this is an expert, and a lawyer, public affairs analyst, a corporate governance expert, Mr. Ebere Okonkwo. Welcome, Mr. Okonkwo.
Thank you for having me.
And you heard me, I tried to navigate the terrain of PPPs, as it were, but what's your general take on this issue?
Well, a good place to start is to recognize that Nigeria is way behind in terms of infrastructural development. We are in deficit.
Exactly.
And that has been on for years. And there has been effort to increase what we're doing in terms of providing infrastructure. The biggest challenge to that, of course, as you've just mentioned, is dwindling finances. We have maxed out now borrowings, and even though this is arguable, people still want to borrow more. But there are the options that are available, as you've stated, as to how we can begin to make progress around our infrastructural projects in roads, in rail, water, health, sanitation, and all of that. So for us, it's important on the onset to say PPP is not a silver bullet.
Okay.
It isn't a silver bullet. It isn't even a luxury. It is a necessity because of where we find ourselves. Okay, PPP is not a solution. It's an intervention, in my view, because of where we are at the moment. And because public budgets are dwindling, we have to find other innovative ways of getting our projects off the ground and providing infrastructure to our increasing population.
But is it not a better model that you'd wonder why we haven't used more of it? Because I'm thinking of PPPs as a scenario where the public meets the private. The private sector has the efficiencies to ensure their projects work. The public, you can raise more money from the public, but you also have to have the buy-in of the public in the success of projects and also the maintenance of projects, so that they feel like they're part owners of this project. So therefore, why aren't we using more of PPPs?
Well, in the totality of the infrastructure mix, the public sector will continue to play the leading role in providing infrastructure.
Invariably.
Our Constitution places the burden of providing security and enhancing the lives of citizens at the doorstep of the government, which means that the large amount of finance that will be deployed in providing these infrastructural projects will come from the public sector. But then, just like you've said, we have to get innovative about it. are we being efficient with the ones that we have built? I've said in other fora that development, brick and mortar development has not quite gone far for us in Nigeria, because also, and every Nigerian mouths off these days that we have a very poor maintenance culture. Every Nigerian knows that we have a poor maintenance culture, but then again, you find the public sector goes and dumps an infrastructure somewhere, and it's poorly maintained. That's why we are thinking that we now need to begin to tend towards a partnership between the private sector and the public sector in a way that we take the private sector efficiency, bring in the private sector efficiency and the private sector value for money. Because that's the key thing. There are things you will hear about infrastructural projects in this country that will make you cry. Government takes up to 20 billion naira and dumps in a project somewhere, and it isn't generating anything. It isn't working at all. So that's why we're having this conversation, because we believe that at this point we need to democratize this relationship between the private sector and the public sector more.
Yes. So I was in Morocco last week, and one shocking thing, just passing through Casablanca to another region, was the amount of investment the Moroccans have made in housing for their people. And invariably, perhaps there's a law, everybody in Morocco lives in a flat. You must live in a flat. And so you see rows and rows and rows of blocks of flats. Some of them a bit older, some of them fairly new, and new ones are being built. Vast areas have been demolished. They are right under a monarchy, and I'm wondering how the monarchy got them to do this, And so I'm very much enthralled when you say that, indeed, in terms of even the brick and mortar, we haven't started. And if you fly into Abuja, or you're flying out of Abuja, when you look down from the plane, you see a metastasis of shanties almost into the runway of Abuja Airport, which the government has sort of allowed in the last few years, very unfortunately. At some point in time, we're going to go there and start demolishing all of those places. People will cry and what have you, So, but is there any, I wanted to ask you, is there any PPP transactions at the national level that's successful, or even at the state level? Do you have any records of some of this?
Well, a lot is going on in terms of public-private partnerships. At the national level, we can at least start by describing steps that have been taken by the government to institutionalize public-private partnerships. We have had the Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission Act of 2005, and from then we have made progress in terms of instituting a PPP framework. We now have the national policy for PPP, which has now created an environment where I believe that based on the guidelines, based on the policy, private sector people should be more comfortable to make investments in infrastructure in those transactions, without, of course, you cannot completely eliminate political risk, you cannot completely eliminate the risk of the environment, but I believe that within the framework that the government has put in place, public-private partnerships should be picking up right now. But I'll tell you a few things why the private sector is not very, they're not very keen. Because again, you have to go back to institutional readiness. When you're doing PPP, those projects are domiciled with MDAs. And you know the challenges that we have with MDAs, the red tape, the bureaucracy, the lack of capacity, and also the lack of technical capacity, So most times the private sector is pushing, but the public sector partner isn't moving with as much speed, and so you find that those transactions where the public sector is supposed to be contributing, you cannot see those transactions gaining much much traction. But on a national scale, there are road PPPs, there are water PPPs.
Okay.
There are also electricity PPPs, power PPPs that are ongoing. As a matter of fact, the ICRC used to publish what is called the PPP project pipeline, which is a list of projects that are PPP ready and that are at different phases of the PPP cycle. Okay, some are in the feasibility stage, some are in other stages of the PPP cycle. Nationally speaking, a lot is going on. It is actually, our focus should be now with the MDAs and at the subnational level, where we believe, you know that I consistently insist that development should go to the grassroots.
Do the states have the capacity for, to have a good pipeline for PPP projects? Legally speaking, are they enabled to start and finish, such transactions? That's my first question. The second one is with regard to issues of legal ownership of projects. So if I'm a private sector person, I get into this PPP transaction with government, government still owns it, therefore government can do anything they like, or do I part own it? If I part own it, how do we share that power? Will I be allowed the free rein to run that transaction the way I would run a private sector transaction?
Okay, so we go back to the definition of PPP. It's a long-term contract where a public entity engages a private entity for the delivery of a public service or a public product or a public asset, okay, in an arrangement where the private entity retains management responsibility and assumes significant risk, and remuneration is based on performance. So if you follow this definition, you will see that in most PPPs, there is some type of transfer of ownership, even if it's only economic ownership.
Okay.
For instance, in some models where you have build, operate, and transfer, and if it's long-term, you know that within the term of that contract, the private sector partner retains economic ownership and can deal with that property with the efficiency that he wants to deal with. However, of course, this does not discount the other risks that are attendant to such transactions, that are also risks that we believe that the private sector entity is attuned to bearing. He has ways and means of dealing with those risks. So PPP is a very fine way of delivering infrastructure projects. There are some that are going on right now. Some in Benin City. I've seen some. I've seen a water project in the Uromi axis where the Edo State government is doing something.
What kind of project is that?
It's a water reticulation project. Okay. The dam is built, the water treatment plant is built, and now a private entity is likely to be engaged to reticulate water to the individual households. You see, if this has not gone all the way up to the time where the households get the water, you can have that whole infrastructure that's been built by, maybe the federal government has built the dam, but it stays there and it's only impounding water and the water has not been used. But if you bring in a private entity and they bring in their finance, they are able to do the reticulation that takes water, and they bill the public in a user pays arrangement, and then they retrieve the cost of their own investment, and everybody is fine with that. If you have some in housing too, where the government provides land, and then the private entity builds, and then it can be dealt with in a whole lot of ways. It could be dealt with in sales, it could be dealt with in leases, okay? And government receives revenue from those assets. And that's why I was coming to the question you asked about state governments, whether they have capacity. Yeah. If you go right around this country, you will see lots of government assets that are performing poorly. Many of those assets have cost government tons and tons of resource, but they are dumped there and they are becoming decrepit, dilapidated, and nobody is using them. there are private sector people that will pass there and say, oh, what I could do with this building.
Yeah.
Okay. But the framework for them to engage the public sector and make profit out of that asset is what we are lacking sorely. And at the local level, the politics and all of that comes into that is usually an inhibition too.
And that's a key risk for the investor, for the private aspect of it is political risk.
Yes, political
risk. The risk that maybe when a new government comes in, they renege on the old agreement. Is there any other risk apart from that for the private sector, if you think about it deeply? And then on the government side, what are the risks to think about as well?
On the government side, usually is the risk of the nature of the contract, the nature of the contract, not
because again, there are private sector smart Alex too, who are ready to rip off government and all of that stuff.
Absolutely, which is actually the reason why ICRC is instituted, because all of that has to go through what we call an outline business case that allows ICRC to determine whether government is getting a proper due, whether this project is viable, whether the government in the structure of the transaction is getting its proper due, okay, and whether government is being shortchanged in any way. Okay, so there are frameworks allowing, which is why I'm surprised that not many more PPPs have gone on. And where, for instance, you have a list of PPPs in 2013, the Jonathan government had about 44 projects on the PPP pipeline. If you looked at the website of ICRC for 2013, 2014 it increased. I'm asking now, what has happened to all of those projects?
What's it looking like now?
Yeah, we can't see.
Oh, they are not putting out information.
Conclusion. Well, I checked the ICRC website earlier this morning to know whether, but the website was not delivering that information. But I know that they say that they have started a disclosure system which allows every individual to be able to look at the projects and see where they are and what has happened. I think that the institutional framework is in place, but Nigerians have to express a bit more faith in the system. The private sector must begin to think in terms of partnering with the government. A few days ago, when I was speaking with a friend, he was saying that Nigerians don't like government. We just think everything government is bad. But government holds a lot of resource, a lot of assets that private sector people don't need to build more.
Yeah.
They can take what has been built and begin to make it profitable. And then release resource for other things.
And there's a new school of thought that I'm beginning to study that believes that indeed all, bar none, of public sector assets should be spun off in a way, and there's this gentleman, Professor Teriba, who has been pushing that. I'm still studying it. There are flaws in the argument, but there's also merit in it to say, for example, what are you doing with Abuja Stadium, for example? Just sitting down there, what if you could find a private sector individual who can run this for profit? Will it not be better and maintain and all of that? And we have so many of these things sitting in all these places. However, we have to take a break now to pay some bills, and then we'll be right back with to continue the discussion. Welcome back, viewers, and we've been talking public-private partnerships in the financing of government projects with Mr. Ebere Okonkwo. Welcome back.
Thank you, sir.
And so before we departed, we were looking at some of those examples around us of projects that could be rightly spun off. I understand that the federal government has recently completed a refurbishment of the abandoned Lagos Stadium, for example, which used to be a national stadium in Lagos. The one in Abuja here was last refurbished for $1 million by businessman Dangote in time for one of the international meets there, which became a disaster. They had to ban Nigeria and all of that. Those are stadiums. We have dams around the country. We have so many other projects that, ordinarily speaking, but my own thinking is that I'd rather, government begin to look at projects where we can get cash flow. For example, the stadiums that I mentioned are such that every week a serious-minded person will schedule programs week by week, whether teams are playing there, people are renting the space, perhaps not to come and stampede the pitch and all of that, So in which way the government can get some cash flow out of it? Maybe I believe in my thinking that it'll be more successful where you can trace some cash flow more than even, let's say, water projects where the people expect to get water for free, or even if you're charging them for providing water, they expect to pay a very small token, I think in Lagos, the government has also tried to do some things with, I think the Lekki Free Zone, Lekki Port, Deep Sea Port, yes. I don't know how far they've gone in terms of inland waterways as well, and so on. What about other states? What are states like Kogi State doing with the confluence and the water resource in those places? We look at every state in Nigeria and what assets they have and how they are using those assets, at least trying to use those assets to maximize their use. Those are considerations.
Our big issue is the idea that government must act like a big brother. You do big this, you dump big assets without a full plan on how those assets will pay for the next set of assets that need to be built. Okay, I've had issues in because I operate in the PPP space, and I've spoken on this issue clearly. I see the federal government goes out and dumps one big asset somewhere, tons of money dumped there, and then it's not been taken all the way to the end of the value chain so that it begins to yield returns and is able to then fund new projects and new infrastructure, which is the reason why we keep borrowing. Now, you talked about the National Stadium. There are lots and lots of these assets. There's somewhere in the southwest, there is a dam that the federal government has deposited lots of resource, built a dam, built a water treatment plant, but has not started serving the people water. If a PPP project is done on that, the people of that state, at least in the state capital, should get water. And there are structures and there are models that allow for social considerations even in water PPPs, in social PPPs.
Oh, okay.
Viability gap funding, where the federal government can then, subsidize, but not on the side of the delivery of the service. Let the private sector person get the return on investment, because that's where the efficiency is, and then the joy to getting on more projects comes from the private sector succeeding in turning those assets around. So these assets abound in the state capitals, in the federation, and even when you get to the states, some MDAs have assets.
Yes. Assets
that are lying down there, which can be concession. And I'm very happy that the federal government has now begun to push its MDAs to commercialize. It's the way to go. It's an important way.
For example, okay, now I'm beginning to think about, remember the old Lagos Secretariat that's rotting away somewhere in Ikoyi? I think there was this dispute about whether Babala King's company won it. And then Babala King's company also got the MMA2, which also became controversial at some point. Maybe they said that the government was not allowing them to get the limit of their contract, and they were barred. They were supposed to be running both the MMA2 and MM1, the old one, which the government said, no, you have to limit. And that gave PPP a bad name in Nigeria. But come to think of it, you have airports in places like Gombe, Akure, now Ado Ekiti, Ekiti is going to have his own. Osun is thinking of his own. All of these things. Why aren't these guys thinking about really commercializing this and actually handing over to so long as there's no, the problem is always that maybe when they come, when a private sector entity comes to say, listen, let us help you to run this thing, someone will say, okay, you know what, my own cut is 10%, my own cut is 20%. Before you know it becomes a mess. But perhaps it would be better, much better, if those places were run by private sector entities. Than
absolutely, absolutely.
In Ondo State, where I'm from as well, they have a dome. There's this dome, a huge conference center. But the last time I went there, for the first time actually, the second time, I went there to a certain section, it was a complete mess already. And this is something that was built maybe about less than 10 years ago. So it's obvious that government, the mentality behind government cannot manage this, number one. Number two, that even if we're going to bring private sector on, we need to really monitor, because again, whether private or public, Nigerians are Nigerians. And we seem to be a bit slack in maintaining anything at all. You know, that's one. I want to also ask a question, which I'll premise on an experience. Recently, I was reading how the Chinese have been able to get rid of or tackle poverty. And a lot of even the anti-poverty projects are private sector led. So they want to tackle poverty, but they're ready to bring in the private sector. The same thing in this Morocco and all of those house projects that I'm talking about. For even peasants to relocate to those places, the private sector is, how can we, there's so much to do in this country. How can we actually get going?
There is resource. Government provides enabling environment, which I have to give it to the Nigerian government. Effort has been made. There's lots of partnership with the United Nations and development finance institutions to establish a framework. If in terms of institutional framework, we are ready for PPP. I cannot deny that.
We have the ICRC.
Yes, we have the ICRC. We
Does
have
the BPA have anything to do?
BPP takes a role because the bidding process for all of these projects has to be competitive.
What about the private Bureau for Privatization, BPE?
No. So what we have is Bureau for Public Procurement, which allows under which we see the competitive bidding for these transactions, which also helps to make the process objective and ensure that the right kind of private sector partner comes in if we follow the process. The problem with us is always circumventing the process. And like they will tell you anytime you go to the ICRC, they say the best protection for your PPP project is to ensure that you follow the rules. If you do not follow the rules, if you circumvent the rules, you're likely going to run into problems, because if the process is not competitive, you're not going to get the best kinds of partners. And if you do not follow the process, you're not going to get the right kind of transaction in place, the right kind of terms that make for the success of the transaction. Because it is not in signing papers, it is in ensuring that the project takes off, is built, and then is managed to the benefit of all parties concerned. Now, I've talked about the institutional framework. Another thing is the fact that we need to begin to encourage private people to see government. I was talking about regulators being regulators and also enablers rather than being inhibitors.
Thank you very much. You've been listening to the discussion on PPPs and the kind of projections that we can have. From what we've heard today, Nigeria can actually begin to double its GDP if we take some of these transactions serious and do them the right way. Like I always say, nothing lasts forever, not even the underdevelopment of Africa or Nigeria. At some point, we'll have to get out of the present quagmire and embrace positivity. Thanks for staying tuned. See you next week.